So we're dealing right now with speciation, which is the topic for the second unit of evolution. And it's the processes involved in the origin of new species. So new species come about through natural selection, can lead to speciation because it'll select for different characteristics. Right? So the natural variations that are found in a population, it can select for different ones of those variations and can drive the species to separate and become new species, or speciate. Speciation also occurs as a result of other microevolutionary processes such as genetic drift, which is where you're going to have different species isolated from the main population, or should different individuals isolated from the main population. So that could happen with Darwin's finches, all right, small groups isolated from the main population, leading to a drift event, all right, moving away, speciating. And mutation is going to add new traits to the population, which could obviously lead to speciation. Morphology and species, external physical characteristics may not be useful in distinguishing species. Members of the same species may appear different because of environmental conditions, and different species can appear identical. So, one of the things that taxonomically species were grouped together based on, the presence of wings. But we know that birds, bats, and insects are all very different from one another, even though they all have wings. So you can't necessarily do that, but you can also see in this slide right here that you have species where they're grown in a different place. So these plant species, if they're grown in water versus grown on land, they're the same species. Same with hydrangeas right here. The soil acidity or alkalinity affects the colors. Same species, but morphologically different from one another. All right? And so that is going to be an important thing to think about when we define a species. So the biological species concept, species are groups of interbreeding natural populations reproductively isolated from other such groups. So a species, it can breed with one another and produce fertile offspring, but they are isolated from other such groups. Okay, and that's important because even when we look at like a horse and a donkey coming together to form a mule, that is going to be a reproductively isolated species because mules can't reproduce with one another. So reproductive isolation is the cornerstone of the biological species concept. Speciation is the attainment of reproductive isolation. Reproductive isolation arises as a byproduct of genetic change. So species change over time. So they genetically diverge. All right. So it's important to realize that reproductive isolation is going to lead to a new species. Now, there's different things that can push that. All right. So genetic divergence is the gradual accumulation of the differences in gene pools of populations. So that change in the gene pool, natural selection is going to change the gene pool because natural selection is going to select for certain characteristics to be more or less present in that gene pool. Genetic drift, if you were to isolate a small part of the population, that will also have an effect on the gene pool, and mutation is going to introduce new traits. So these are all going to lead to divergence. Now, gene flow would be traits flowing back and forth between populations of the same species is going to counter that. It's going to kind of balance it back together. So the idea that, I always use that example of a indoor-outdoor swimming pool. If you had it, I saw it once in my life. It was a swimming pool that indoor, and then it had a little barrier to go outdoor that they would shut during the wintertime. But during the day in the summer, you could swim back and forth. And obviously, if you were to build up in each of those pools, pool toys of a certain type, there could be selection favoring one or the other, and that could lead to speciation, a change in the genes in the population. But that barrier right there, allowing the flow back and forth, countered that and keeps everything kind of balanced. Okay, if that makes sense. It's kind of a very literal example using an actual pool and actual flow, and using pool toys as the genes in the example. Okay, so this is just showing gene flow over time, genetic divergence, that eventually at a certain point there was a selection for a daughter species of plants that would be green. All right. Reproductive isolation mechanisms. So prezygotic mating or zygotic formation is prevented. So basically their reproductive organs don't align, or their gametes are so different that they do not come together. Postzygotic would take place after the hybrid zygotes form. Zygotes may die early, may be weak or sterile. This would be the example of the mule. That would be a postzygotic isolation. Okay, so we see right here, these different things prezygotically, it can also expand to ecological isolation where they're in a different habitat. So obviously two species can't interbreed if they're separated by some kind of different habitat barrier. Temporal isolation would be different mating times. You can think about that in plants heavily. Plants, you have springtime plants, which are blooming now, and you have fall plants, spring allergies, fall allergies. We all know about that. Springtime allergies are starting up, which is a reproductive time for plants. So if a spring plant and a fall plant are reproductively isolated from one another. Behavioral isolation is going to be different behaviors, right? So they have different mating rituals. Birds happens heavily. They have different dances or displays or things like that. And mechanical isolation, the sex organs are just too different from one another for it to work. Size or things like that. And gamete mortality, gametes just do not match up. Okay, we understand that the two gametes come together. You have one half of a homologous pair on each gamete. At a certain point, you have to have those gametes line up, or else you're not going to have traits. We understand that from genetics that there's very little room for error in terms of gametes. You have to have the right amount. Postzygotic zygote mortality, the zygote dies. All right, it's not viable because it formed, but there was too many issues. Hybrid inviability, the hybrid dies. Hybrid sterility, the hybrid can't reproduce. So there's our mule example. It can't reproduce because it's too different. So mechanisms of speciation. This one's pretty cool. Allopatric, separate ranges, appear to be different species. They're separated by a barrier. Now sympatric, they're in the same area, but they remain separate species. So something else, probably a behavioral isolation or a temporal isolation, is going to affect sympatric. So sympatric, same. Allopatric, they're in a different range, and they're different species, but they can't interact with one another anyway to see if speciation would, or see if reproduction would occur. Sympatric speciation, they could theoretically reproduce, but they're so different from one another that they don't. So allopatric, geographically isolated, probably the most common mechanism. Some sort of barrier arises and prevents gene flow. So here we have an example of a geographic isolation of subspecies. We have the milk snake. So we see these different types of snakes, these different forms of their phenotype based on their locations. We see where they are and which type we're going to get based on that, and that's because there's some form of geographic isolation there. All right, we see right here these different types of fish. They're going to be separated by the Isthmus of Panama, which is going to lead to genetic differences. Obviously, selective pressures are going to be slightly different. If we look at this picture right here, we obviously know that the Northeast is going to have a lot more selective pressures that are different than Florida. Okay, obviously, a lot of you have been to Florida in the past. It is, for lack of a better term, Jurassic Park at times, with the alligators and the swamps and the humidity and all that, whereas in the Northeast here, we have winter and we have a lot of different characteristics. Okay, so back to the fish, and now we're going to talk about extensive divergence prevents inbreeding. So species separated by geographic barriers will diverge genetically. Obviously, we'll have different selection events working on those species. They're in separate areas. They're going to diverge because of different selection on them. So if divergence is great enough, it will prevent inbreeding. And even if the barrier disappears, they will be different species. So that we see there is the test of sympatry. Okay, sorry, went a little too far. So test of sympatry. If the barrier disappears, can they still not interbreed? So archipelagos, chains of islands some distance from continents. So we have Galapagos and Hawaiian Islands. Colonization. of the islands, followed by genetic divergence that sets the stage for speciation. So we see the Hawaiian Islands, volcanic islands, adaptive radiations in honey creepers. Okay, in absence of other bird species, they filled numerous niches, so nothing was filling them, so they adaptively radiated into those niches, and we see, look at that. So the founder species resulted in all those different species of birds and beaks based on what niche they filled. So obviously competition, we know, is an issue. You don't want competition. So these species filling different niches affects, lessens competition, and they're going to genetically diverge as a result. Natural selection will select for different traits. So speciation without a barrier, so species form within the home range of parent species. So these two different types of fish, most likely descended from a single ancestors, nor barriers within either lake, and some ecological separation, but species in each lake are in sympatry. So we take a look at these diversity. They're reproductively isolated. They have different feeding patterns. They eat different things, and that's going to lead to their diversity. All right. So plants change in a chromosome number, polyploidy. It's very common in plants. So we see this large grain wheat right here. It's different polyploidy, meaning we see that 2n, or instead of 2n, it's 3n or 4n. Okay, so that 3n and 4n is very important. So we see these large grain wheats, and we see right here, here's an example of how it goes. The unknown, they cross AB, and then something occurs, and a non-disjunction event, and now it's polyploidy, and it has multiple different traits, and that's going to lead to variations. Okay, plants, you get a lot of polyploidy. Obviously, we talked about genetic issues, humans being XXY or having an extra chromosome leading to Down syndrome. There's very few situations in which polyploidy is going to be there, but in plants, it's very common. So, cladogenesis, cladogram, you'll see one is a branching pattern. Lineages split, isolated populations diverge. And anagenesis, no branching, gradual change with a single lineage gene flow throughout the process. So you see right here an anagram, all right, versus a cladogram. It goes right here, but this is showing, the cladogram is showing the species still persisting within. And we see the cladogram right there. We see as it goes along, this is species of animals, vertebrates, and we see these different things coming up. Now we see evolutionary trees. We see a gradualism versus punctuated equilibrium. A punctuated equilibrium, we see drastic changes. Gradualism, we see short changes. We're going to talk about that for a minute here. So gradualism is a speciation model in which many species emerge through many small morphological changes that accumulate. So over time, they kind of add on to a different thing, more and more changes. So fits well with certain evidence from the fossil record. So over time, they accumulate minor variations. So beak changes in Darwin's finches, they got slightly bigger over time. Adaptive radiation, a burst of divergence. Single lineage gives rise to many new species. New species fill vacant adaptive zones. An adaptive zone is a niche, a way of life. So we see this burst of adaptive radiation after the Mesozoic into the Cenozoic, and we see all these different animals filling them. So a punctuated equilibrium versus a gradualism, we see right here, after a major event that occurs, you're usually going to see some kind of punctuated equilibrium, long periods of stasis followed by a massive change. But you're also going to see gradualism within that. So there's two very different theories, but they fit depending on which species you're looking at. And extinction is the irrevocable loss of a species. Mass extinctions have played a major role in evolutionary history. Fossil record shows 20 or more large-scale extinctions, and it's a reduced diversity followed by adaptive radiation. So it's important to understand that diversity is taken back because you killed, the event killed many species, but those niches are then filled by other species.